Excluding episode 0, where we don't actually see the main protagonist of this story, the first episode of Mushoku Tensei Season 2 actually started at quite the slow pace, which if you compare it with the previous season, is not how they used to do it. Episode 1 of Season 1 immediately started throwing everything at us to grab our attention. Rudeus gets reincarnated, he discovers magic and starts practicing it, we got to learn about the details of the magic system, and we even got the first magic lesson with Roxy, ending it off with a motivating resolution speech from Rudeus. That's a lot of things to cobble together into one episode, and I think they nailed it. Even the second core of Season 1 started off with some pretty significant plot developments. Rudeus got his demon eye, and Rudeus agreed to being smuggled across the sea after a heartfelt moment with Rudeus. There are at least plot elements that actually matter down the road. But looking at the start of Season 2, it feels blander in comparison. Not much went down. We got to meet the members of Counter Arrow, and we arrived at a new town, but that's about it. In terms of working towards the main goal, which is for Rudy to find his mom, we didn't really get much in that direction. The most amount of action we got was Rudeus and Counter Arrow teaming up for a minor mission for money, which can hardly be called important in the grand scheme of things. So the question is, why did they do it this way? And why do I absolutely love this first episode as our venture back into this amazing world? To answer that, let's rewind back to the end of the first season, just to refresh our memory of what happened before Rudeus set off to find Zenith. And well, the guy had it rough. Shortly after literally getting murdered, he comes back to his hometown to find it decimated. Then his good friend and mentor figure, whom he spent years together with, decides to leave him since his job of bringing them back home is done. But that's alright, since that wasn't exactly unexpected. And hey, he gets to reunite with a familiar face. Just to realize later that the kind people that took you in, the close family of the girl you've also been traveling with all this time, either didn't survive in the disaster or was unjustly executed. If that wasn't devastating enough for both him and Eris, there are even plans to marry off Eris to some random noble, threatening to not only take her away from Rudeus, but also basically making Eris give up her entire future. There are just bombshells after bombshells, barely giving him space to breathe and just be glad that he's arrived back in his hometown. Deep in thought, he's visited in his tent by Eris, who comes offering the intimacy he's wanted all this time out of nowhere. Knowing Eris's emotional state, he does display the maturity and restraint he's built up over these years, and refuses out of concern that this might be taking advantage of her, but it doesn't take much more to push him over the edge. Having done the deed, he's of course ecstatic, but it's not long before he realizes that Eris has left him with Ghislaine for some unknown reason. At this moment, it really does seem like he's lost everything. The party that he's given everything for, Dead End, is now completely disbanded, with one member seemingly having just abandoned him. Aside from his dad, maid, and 2 sisters, all his other acquaintances are either dead or missing, with them possibly being on the other side of the world. He would have had the strength to find all his missing people, but that strength came from his party. With his party gone, he's completely unmotivated, sulking away on his bed like his old self. With this predicament, it's not surprising that Rudy would be absolutely downtrodden at the start of Season 2. Even if he didn't actually lose everything, it would certainly have seemed like that for him. Unlike the start of Season 1, Rudeus doesn't have that gung-ho attitude to him at the start of this season. Before the end of the episode, he's pretty much just aimlessly drifting along, perhaps trying to find a purpose to him that could motivate him like before. Since Rudeus is our protagonist and whose perspective we see through to look into this world, the show's pacing adapts appropriately to reflect his mental state. And with him in such a sorry state, it's only natural that not much happens in the show. He doesn't have the strength right now to be that Rudeus that used to tackle his problems head on. He doesn't really even want to do anything. And when you're in that situation, it really does feel like time slows down for you. It feels like nothing is happening, because you don't care about what happens around you. This is why I love the opening to this season, because it totally immerses you into how Rudeus is feeling. Everything feels quiet and slow, not because there's actually nothing going on in the world, but mainly because that's how Rudeus sees the world around him as of that moment. The anime just lets you feel his emotions for yourself, not even putting in music for most of the episode to highlight the lack of mental energy Rudeus has right now. I know it's a cliche to say this when examining the writing in anime, but this really is the epitome of that show don't tell concept. And aside from just being good on its own, that also helps a lot for the show as a second season. Usually, because anime seasons are quite a bit apart from each other in time, to remind the audience of what happened last season, a lot of anime would either give a little recap on what happened by the end of the last season, or have the characters discuss what happened in some organic way. That works well enough to drag people back in, but Mushoku Tensei went beyond that. Using that show don't tell technique, Mushoku Tensei brings people back in the story not by reminding them of the plot, but by reminding them of the feelings they felt from last season. We get sucked back into the story, not because we got some narration from Rudeus about how Eris left him, but because we got to feel once again how he feels about Eris leaving him. Feelings are strong things, and by utilizing them, Mushoku Tensei doesn't need to do a recap for the audience. Just making us feel those emotions again makes us immediately remember everything that matters about Rudeus' story, with the added bonus that it gets us invested right away. Seeing him depressed like this makes us immediately remember what made him sad like that, and seeing him being out here anyway to do what he needs to do despite that makes us immediately remember what motivated him to get out in the first place. But hold on, that's right. Didn't he resolve to save Zenith at the end of the first season? One would think that since he took that step, he would have already gotten over Eris and everything else, right? Well, here's where Mushoku Tensei slaps you with a good dose of realism. A lot of anime stories might have the classic pep talk from one of the protagonist's buddies, and after they regain their motivation and decide to continue their fight, they immediately get a surge of power to do what they need to do. And while I'm not calling those stories bad, they are fiction after all, that's not always how it works in the real world, is it? Emotion and motivation aren't absolutes. Despite how we wish it could be, sometimes making that one decision might not be quite enough. It certainly is a necessary step. Rudeus had to go ahead and decide to go out to find Zenith in order to get back on his feet, but it doesn't mean making that one decision would change everything for him. While there can be moments where you just completely rip ass after you muster up the resolve to make that one decision, there are also times where you simply just took a singular step on a very long journey, and that's how it's going for Rudeus. As applaudable as him taking that first step was, that was only the start of his new journey. On that journey, he is going to have to overcome many more hurdles. And as unfortunate as it might be, it just so happened that his first hurdle was the mental trauma that carried over from his last adventure. Honestly, before I saw this episode, I expected them to go the classic anime route, where Rudeus starts out with his gung-ho attitude right off the bat, because he had found a new source of motivation in saving his mother. But they really surprised me by having Rudeus actually take his time in healing from the mental damage dealt to him by Eris, and properly tying up that plot point, at least for the time being. Not only is that, again, a really good way of reminding the audience of what happened last season, it's also just some really well written and realistic character writing. But even though taking this slow and having Rudeus take his time to heal is great, it's not like we got a completely quiet episode either. After being pretty silent for most of the episode, both in terms of Rudeus himself and the background music, we get to see Rudeus finally able to gather the strength to stand up for himself. And that leads to this epic moment where the music swells up, hitting us with that familiar Mushoku Tensei vibe through the beautiful mix of strings and flutes, all while the snow melts at Rudeus' feet, and his fireball materializes and grows to a ridiculous size in a matter of seconds, leaving Sarah completely stunned in awe. With a battle cry that no one could have expected him to produce before this moment, he launches the giant fireball at his enemies. The music climaxes, and the explosion happens. This is where the show officially tells you, Mushoku Tensei is back, baby. Even though so little happened in this episode, the first episode wasn't just for Rudeus to wallow in his sadness. Despite the show giving time for Rudeus to process his pain, the episode still had a goal, and that is to have Rudeus get his purpose back. It was to not only remind Rudeus of what he had resolved to do after being reincarnated in this world, but also to remind us, the audience, what Rudeus' journey was all about in the first place as well. And that purpose, the whole reason that he even tried at all in the first place, was simply to live seriously. Now that he had been given a second chance at life in this new world, he had to hold on to that chance to live seriously, no matter the cost. Through all the crazy circumstances he's went through in the events of Season 1, not only was it easy for the audience to forget his purpose, it was also very easy for Rudeus to have forgotten his purpose, when so much of his new life has been out of his control. And well, he did just that. He had forgotten his purpose. But fortunately, the members of Counter Arrow managed to remind him of his declaration at the very beginning of his new life, and in repayment, Rudeus saved the entirety of Counter Arrow with his freshly recovered motivation. If you'll allow me to gush for a tiny bit, this was easily the highlight of the episode for me. The silence of the entire episode before this set up this moment so well in contrast, fully demonstrating the difference in mental states that Rudeus was in before and after seeing Counter Arrow stand their ground and fight. Through the masterful use of music and subtle changes in the voice acting, I could feel the moment Rudeus starts bouncing back from his trauma. My face lit up when he summoned his fireball, not just because the screen lit up as well with pretty fire animation, but also because I just know the fire in his heart has been lit up as well. Sorry, wrong anime. With that moment, we got a fantastic resolution to the episode, and a wonderful kickstart to the season, as we are reminded of what we originally came to this series to see, a young man named Rudeus Greyrat and his journey of self-improvement in this fantastical world. As I keep thinking about this episode, I could keep on coming up with more individual little things to praise about in this episode, but ultimately, I think this episode, and arguably every other episode of Mushoku Tensei I suppose, but especially this episode, shows where the benchmark for truly great fantasy writing should be, to have the action driven by the story, and not a story driven by action. When writing fantasy, obviously, a major focus would be on the amazing world building and all these amazing ideas the writer came up with for their world and the characters in it. A big part of that world building is often the combat system, and usually that's one of the parts that gets the audience's attention. I mean, it's combat, it's action. Who doesn't like to read or look at flashy fighting involving a unique battle system? No matter if it's the writer or the audience, it's very easy to put your focus on the action. And hey, that's perfectly fine. There's no problem in having an action-focused story, but I don't think that makes the best stories. In Demon Slayer, yes, I'm going off on Demon Slayer again, my bad. In Demon Slayer, even before my problems with the power scaling kicked in, there's another, very minor problem that I had with the show. The fights in Demon Slayer are all very flashy, and the emotional beats were very well written, but something that was always kind of missing was the connective tissue between those big fights. Take some of the main arcs for example. The whole Spider family arc on the mountain was really nice, but the reason Tanjiro got there wasn't anything story significant at all. It's not like someone told him, hey, there might be a clue to how to cure your sister on this mountain. He was simply assigned there, and then the crow told him to get there. Infinity Train was also fantastic, but again, he was just sent there. Entertainment District arc is where we started to question whether the production team goes to sleep at all, but the instigating event? Tanjiro walked past by chance while Uzui was trying to kidnap some young girls on a mission. As great as these arcs might be on their own, there's barely any story significant connective tissue here. The arcs don't flow into each other. If you cut out a few parts, you might as well just have a separate story for each arc. This is what I mean by an action-driven story. The story pretty much exists for the action, existing only to bring the audience from one big fight sequence to the next, doing the bare minimum to connect these fight sequences together as a coherent story. But let me reiterate, this is perfectly fine. Especially in this day and age, with our barely existent attention spans, it's perfectly reasonable to go with a story that's one flashy event after the other, repeatedly grabbing the audience's attention, and caring less about the story as a whole, since people might not even remember what happened anyway. That's why we have so many successful shows that simply go all out with their action with no restraint, and have quite a lot of major events happen just because they needed to happen for the next fight. But for Mushoku Tensei, even though its world building and combat system are so in-depth, they still hold back from shoving action scenes at us when they need to, like how it was in this episode. That's because Mushoku Tensei considers his characters as most important despite its amazing world, and it values those characters' stories over anything else. Rudeus didn't just wander into this faraway town, he actively chose to go there because he wanted to go find Zenith. He didn't take the commission with Counter Arrow and get dragged into an action scene just because he's an adventurer and adventurers naturally get into fights. He took it because he needed to get the money and later the fame that came with it in order to find Zenith. The story isn't happening to him or in spite of him, it's happening precisely because of him and his actions. Him getting attacked by grizzlies and using that giant fireball didn't happen because we needed a flashy fight, but it's because of his decision to do what he needs to do to find Zenith. This is what I mean by story-driven action. Instead of using the story to bring the show from one fight sequence to another, the story and characters take the spotlight over the fight scenes. Instead of having the story linked together separate fight sequences as a coherent narrative, the fight scenes are part of the connective tissue that holds the story together, and so its fight scenes only happen when the story needs it to happen, and it serves the purpose of the story. And that means when it's not necessary, the story shows proper restraint and does not stuff in the fight scene in our face. That allows the series to actually exist as one completely coherent story, because a good story needs to have its ups and downs, and constantly having action scenes can easily disrupt that. Not only that, another good thing about having the action happen because of the story instead of the other way around is that the action scenes actually get enhanced by the story. Think about it. Rudeus only used one flashy move here, a very simple, giant fireball. Explosions like that are very common in action anime, but why was it so hype? That's because this action sequence was not only the visual climax of the episode, but also the emotional climax. Rudeus here is having his life light up for the first time ever since Eris left him, and by saving the bombastic action scene until this point, this action sequence, even though it was so short, was able to deliver maximum impact, because all those emotions were built up before this point to release all at once. If Rudeus was fighting the whole episode despite him being super depressed, it would just feel like he's going through the motions, and a giant fireball like that at the end wouldn't hit nearly as hard. If I were to use an analogy to compare action-driven stories and story-driven action, I would say that action-driven stories are like scrolling through short-form videos on TikTok or YouTube Shorts, and that narratives with story-driven action are like long-form video essays. Short-form videos by nature are designed to be impactful, so every time you scroll to the next post, you get a big belly laugh and go to the next post. Even though the posts you see are regulated by the algorithm and are somewhat relevant to each other to fit your tastes, it's likely you'll forget about the first post you've seen after scrolling past the 10th one. Action-driven stories are the same. You go through each epic fight sequence, experience the moments of hype, and then you move on to the next moment. You're likely to forget about the previous moments unless you're reminded about them, because the latest moments are so flimsily connected to those previous moments. Long-form video essays, on the other hand, are designed to be enjoyed as a whole, and actually good video essayists, aka not me, have each significant part of the video lead into the next one, and construct their long video into one complete narrative. There might be memes and funny gags in there, but they are there to service and support the main point of the video essay, instead of taking over the video and becoming the main content. That's what narratives with story-driven action are like. They don't let the action sequences take over the main story, and allow for a complete narrative to take place. You're likely to remember each significant moment more firmly, because the newest moment happens as a result of the previous moments, and everything is tightly connected like that as one big story. And no, this isn't me trying to say long-form video essays are superior. If they were, short-form videos wouldn't be popping off like they are now. All I'm saying is, I prefer the long-form video essays, and similarly, I simply prefer story-driven action. It's not like action-driven stories are inferior, they're popular for a reason. I just adore Mushoku Tensei for not being that, since the market is quite saturated with those kinds of stories. This first episode was deliberately made slow for a reason. Not only does that make the episode itself hard-hitting and immersive, it enhances the whole story along with it, and showcases why Mushoku Tensei is so excellent at telling the story it wants to tell, the story of Rudeus' journey of self-improvement. I'm telling you, this story kept surprising me with its consistent quality of storytelling, episode after episode back in season 1, and they just gave me the confirmation with this first episode that quality of storytelling is likely to continue in season 2. I'm truly excited about what's to come. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like for me. If you want to see more, subscribe down below. Leave your comments in the comment section if you have anything to say about anything Mushoku Tensei. And check out my streams when I go online here on YouTube. You're welcome to hang out and chat and talk to me about anime, among other things. That's about it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!